Let's look at what Wes Huff had to say about the Dead Sea Scrolls on Joe Rogan's podcast, because it perfectly demonstrates this problem.
Before he misinformed Joe Rogan about the Dead Sea Scrolls,
there is absolutely no sense in which it is correct to say that. But that's always the starting point for apologetic approaches to this kind of discussion.
Nope, don't have time for that. Hello guys. So recently, as in about 2 months ago, a Christian apologist named Wes Huff went on the Joe Rogan podcast, which is the most popular podcast in the entire world. And you know, after like 50 years of atheists telling us all kinds of crazy things like that Jesus never existed, that Christianity is bad for science, and humanism has rescued us from the shackles of religion, yeah, suddenly those people are really critical about Christian apologists not getting all the facts right. Now, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the accusations accomplished among us, just as those who were from the beginning critics of Christianity, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to record it for you in a mostly consecutive order, excellent viewer, so that you might know the exact truth of the things you have been taught. And so I have spent the last few weeks really going over a whole bunch of videos, like a 20 video long playlist, starting with the Joe Rogan podcast, to the immediate critics, to the defenders, an average of probably like 30 minutes to an hour per video, watching them multiple times, taking snippets to create over 60 reference videos, study those very diligently. This has been a lot of work. So, without further ado, let's get to it. Now, the thing Wes has gotten the most criticism from was something he said about the Great Isaiah Scroll, also known as 1Q Isaiah A, where he said its relation to the Masoretic text, that is the text from which we translate most of our Old Testament. He said that the two are, quote, word for word identical.
And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
A scholar named Dan McClellan, who has a YouTube channel, he did a video correcting that.
So this is wildly inaccurate. The Great Isaiah Scroll, or 1Q Isaiah A, differs from the Masoretic text in almost every single verse of the book of Isaiah. Now, the majority of those differences are spelling differences or only minor differences in meaning, but there are a lot of them, and there are also a number of significant differences.
So yeah, Wes Huff made a boo-boo. There are many variants between the Great Isaiah Scroll and the Masoretic text. However, Dan misspoke. I'm going to just let him explain it, though.
And that's not correct. Now, in my head, I was thinking of the critical apparatus of the critical edition of the Great Isaiah Scroll and how there are variants in virtually every single verse, something like 99% of the verses. However, I was ignoring the fact that not all of those verses differed from the Masoretic text. Some of them differed from other Isaiah manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls or other major manuscripts of Isaiah, such as the Septuagint or the Peshitta or something like that. So I was wrong there.
So yeah, Dan just made a slight mistake, saying that there's a variation in practically every verse, when actually those variations are spread out amongst a whole bunch of different scrolls, not just the Great Isaiah Scroll and the Masoretic text. However, he corrected himself for that. So I'm going to give Dan a self-correction kudo. The good points will be over here. The bad points will be over here. It is always good when you're engaged in debates and scholarship that you make sure you correct your errors, and Dan did that. However, let's go back to his first video.
So the notion that the Great Isaiah Scroll represents word for word the Masoretic text, and that this shocked scholars, is 100% false. That's not true at all. But that's always the starting point for apologetic approaches to this kind of discussion. And then the goalposts inevitably will be moved to, well, none of these readings affect doctrine or change Christianity or anything like that. But there are a bunch of problems with that attempt to move the goalposts. The first is that it's not true. It has significant impact on the doctrine of inerrancy. Second is that that's not the argument I'm engaging. I'm engaging the claim that scholars were shocked to discover that 1Q Isaiah A matched the Masoretic text word for word. It does not, and scholars were not shocked. And then finally, if the concern is really that no doctrines are affected, then begin with that. the repeated desire to start from this claim that there are no differences, or that there are no meaning differences, or that there are no significant meaning differences, is an apologetic misdirection, because it's an attempt to try to cut off further complication of ideas about the preservation of the biblical text. And so what this demonstrates is that, at least for this discussion and this particular question, Wes is not interested in presenting the data. Wes is interested in an apologetic approach.
Ouch. All right, so there's a lot here. First off, I want to say that I am in agreement in many ways with Dan. Yes, we should be careful not to overstate our case and then just backpedal it, or at least we shouldn't do that intentionally. Sometimes it just naturally happens, or we may misspeak. You know, it does happen. And so yes, I agree with Dan on that. However, there are some problems with this also, and that is he really was poisoning the well with this entire section. He really presenting it as the apologetic approach or apologetic misdirection to cut off complications for your beliefs. He says, and quote, Wes is not interested in presenting the data. That is an ad hominem. Now, Dan gave us our first good point over here. He's also giving us our first bad point over here. The dishonest apologist accusation. However, Dan also addresses this in his second video.
But I wanted to make a video pointing it out to everybody and more publicly apologizing to Wes for that misinformation, as well as for characterizing the error that he made as intentional, as apologetic misdirection. Wes says that that was not his intent, and I have no data that suggests otherwise. So I'm going to take Wes at his word and apologize for attributing malicious intents to his mistake.
I think that is a fair and noble thing to do. So, another point over here for an apology. Now, we're still on stage 1, and the best way to cap off a stage 1 is with a beginner boss, which will set the stage for the rest of the game. And who better to present the boss battle at the end of stage 1 than the famous Alex O'Connor?
Was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word.
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that would be amazing if it were true. In fact, the Dead Sea version of the Isaiah scroll is not quite identical to the Masoretic text, that is, the one that we know from the Bible. Can you guess how many textual variants there are between the two? Take a guess. 1 that Wes forgot about? 10? 100? Try more than 2,600. Yeah. Now, most of these variants are small. They're differences in spelling, for example, but some of them are more significant. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 2, the end of verse 9 and all of verse 10 are simply missing from the Dead Sea version. They're just not there, which tells us that they were a later addition. Here are some words from the Digital Dead Sea Scrolls project by the Israel Museum, which houses the Isaiah scroll. The text of the Great Isaiah scroll generally confirms the Masoretic or traditional version codified in medieval codices, all 66 chapters of the Hebrew version in the same conventional order. At the same time, however, the 2,000-year-old scroll contains alternative spellings, scribal errors, corrections, and most fundamentally, many variant readings. Strictly speaking, the number of textual variants is well over 2,600, ranging from a single letter, sometimes one or more words, to complete variant verse or verses. Well over 2,600. Again, many of these variants are minor, but Wes Huff told Joe Rogan that the scroll is word for word identical with the Masoretic text, which is simply not true.
Alright, as stated with Dan's video, yes, the honest truth is that these variants do exist. Alex presented this data quite honestly. The variants do exist, there are a whole lot of them, and most of them are spelling variants. Technically, spelling would not change the word-for-word claim, but not all of them are spelling related. Now, this video is going to be way longer than I initially planned, so the part about Isaiah 2, 9, and 10 being missing, I'm not going to have time to really get into anything of that. I don't mean to just ignore it, I just don't have time for it. But just when it got to the end of the first stage boss battle, and our hero looked like he was down and defeated, another ally came in to save the day, a Christian apologist and pastor, Gavin Ortland. He did a video response to Alex O'Connor. Gavin explains these variations as orthography. Let's hear him out.
But it needs to be emphasized that the majority of these discrepancies are about tiny issues like spelling, not even necessarily errors of spelling, just differences. One scholar notes that these variations are mostly occasioned by considerations of orthography. Orthography is the conventional spelling system of a particular language, kind of like how Americans might use this spelling, color, C-O-L-O-R, but the British people weirdly put a U in that word.
I probably shouldn't have insulted British spelling to Alex O'Connor.
The Great Isaiah Scroll, it's under discussion here, contains spellings that reflect its own historical context. So that wouldn't affect the word-for-word claim that Wes made. Word for word doesn't necessarily mean word for identically spelled word. So the 2,600 figure here is potentially very misleading for onlookers. Now, to his credit, Alex acknowledges that most of these variations are very small.
All right, so what does Gavin mean that the Great Isaiah Scroll reflects historical context? There's another video from another Christian apologist, Sean McDowell, who brings the scholar Anthony Ferguson on to explain some of these things.
1Q Isaiah A preserves a later linguistic profile. It has a later spelling practice. It uses the consonant vav to indicate O or U, or even what's called a vocal schwa, which is a half vowel, often in 1Q Isaiah A, to a degree that the MT does not do. It says 1Q Isaiah A also loves to do this double consonant called a vav aleph. And it's very, very strange, or yod aleph. So there's this conjunction called ki in Hebrew. And ki can mean things like for or when and because, and it's spelled kaf yod. But in 1Q Isaiah A, it's often spelled with an aleph at the end. I mean, it just has a different spelling practice, Sean. So if in your statistics you're going to include all of that, then obviously the statistics are going to be much, much lower.
All right, so we can see different spelling traditions. Much like how Gavin was describing the British putting a U in certain words like color or flavor or stuff like that, Hebrew also has different spelling traditions. Now, Hebrew doesn't have traditional vowels, so it uses certain consonants to fill in for certain vowels. So the aleph can fill in for an A or an E, the vav can fill in for an O or U, and then a yod can also fill in for kind of like an I or a Y. Then there's also ayin, which also kind of functions as an A or an E, but also kind of acts as like a glottal stop. So again, just like the British put a U in certain words, certain dialects of Hebrew puts in a vav or a hey or an extra aleph or an extra ayon to fill in that space. But Anthony Ferguson does go on to talk more about the historical context and the dialectic difference between the Great Isaiah Scroll from the Masoretic text.
And the people at Masada are Pharisees. They're mainline Jews who have fled Jerusalem after the first Jewish revolt, and they take their text with them, and you have Masoretic texts. The people in the desert have both. They have the NIV, the NLT, the Message, the NASB. They have all of it, right? And why do they have it? Well, that's a good question. Why do they have diversity and unity? You know, these things don't contradict one another. Actually, it's actually common, Sean, for me from the pulpit to say, hey, I'm reading from the ESV. Whose translation says this? And people raise their hand. Whose translation says this? And people raise their hand. I mean, it's a Bible study tool. Different translations, different approaches to copying the Bible helps us understand the Bible. And the people at Qumran loved the Bible. So they have a lot of tools to help them understand God's word.
Now let's go back to Gavin Ortland's video.
So I'm not 100% sure what Wes meant by word for word. I'll leave that for him to clarify, and I've not reached out to him to ask what he meant because I imagine he is fairly inundated these days. And I don't have enough expertise in this area to even have a real fine-tuned opinion of how close exactly is the Isaiah of the Dead Sea Scrolls and of the Masoretic text. But the general point that Wes was making seems totally correct here. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was a remarkable confirmation that the Hebrew text that we have had all along goes back into deep antiquity.
All right, so a couple of things. I gotta credit Gavin for a couple of things here. One, he didn't want to speak for Wes. He didn't want to jump the gun and attack him, nor did he want to try to create some kind of big defense for him. His approach is just let Wes speak for Wes. Two, he articulated that this is not his special field. He's not particularly knowledgeable about the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's not overstating his credentials. He's making sure his audience knows that he's not the ultimate authority in this. Now, on the flip side, he's kind of doing what Dan McClellan said would happen. Yeah, sure, there are variants, but none of them really affect the meaning of it. Dan McClellan says that this is moving the goalposts, and to be honest, I don't really think it is. I understand Dan's concern on that, but I wouldn't call it a moving the goalposts fallacy. It's kind of the natural progression of the conversation. Are there variants? Yes. Well, okay, what do those variants mean? Are they significant? Are they important?
My favorite commentary on Isaiah that I use whenever I preach from this book notes the overwhelming identity between these two as an astonishing tribute to careful copying. Here's how another scholar puts it. Even though the 2 copies of Isaiah found in Qumran Cave 1 near the Dead Sea in 1947 were 1,000 years earlier than the oldest dated manuscript previously known, AD 980, they proved to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. But in one manuscript, the preserved text is almost letter for letter with the Leningrad manuscript. And then it notes that this 5% variation is mainly variations in spelling or obvious slips of the pen or that kind of thing.
All right, so I thought these sources were kind of interesting. First, we got the J. Alec Mortier, which describes it as an astonishing tribute. Now, remember back when Dan said that scholars were not shocked about the Great Isaiah Scroll? Now, J. Alec Mortier is saying it is an astonishing find.
You know, Wes Huff did say the initial scholars were shocked. That's a very true statement. I mean, you can look at Edward Kucher's book. This book is a monumental book in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And on page 2, I believe, he says the consensus, the most remarkable aspect of 1Q Isaiah A to those who initially discovered it was its alignment to the Masoretic text. Scholars immediately recognized this. So when Wes Huff says, scholars were shocked, he's exactly right. They weren't shocked that it was word for word identical, but they were shocked about how closely it aligned to MT.
Later, Dan was on a podcast with another Christian YouTuber named Rusan, and in that video, Dan said that he would have been okay with a word like excited, just not shocked.
But were there any folks that could have been excited about these developments?
I think absolutely. They're probably, like, excitement is one thing. This is one of the most incredible archaeological discoveries of the modern world. Has entirely revolutionized our understanding of the textual transmission of the Bible, even our understanding of the development of the Hebrew language. This was a sea change for the study of the Bible. So excited, ecstatic, absolutely. But I don't think shocked is a good way to characterize how scholars responded to being made aware of the proximity, the textual proximity of 1Q Isaiah A to the Masoretic text.
Now, this is what I call the critical thesaurus fallacy. You can say the word astonished, you can say the word amazed, you can say the word excited, but you can't say the word shocked. Now, isn't shocked just a synonym for amazed, astonished, excited? Don't those all mean the same thing? So what's Dan's beef with the word shocked? Why is he okay with these other words, but not shocked? A second source Gavin presented is one from Gleason Archer, where he describes the scrolls as being 1,000 years separate and word for word identical in 95% of the text. Now, this sounds quite strikingly similar to what Wes was saying.
But when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
So it almost seems like he had this quote in mind when he said it. It seems like he just slipped and forgot to say the in 95% of the text, which of course is a very important part of that. But we are going to be coming back to this quote.
Now, one thing we have to remember here is Wes was speaking not from a manuscript, but spontaneously and organically in a 3.5-hour conversation in a highly pressurized context. People who have not done that have no idea how challenging that is. He's also speaking at a popular level, which requires necessary simplification. So I think we should give some grace to matters of precise wording for someone to clarify the exact details.
All right, now these are two more valid points. That Wes was speaking without a script, really not knowing what was going to be talking about in that interview. It was just really off the cuff. The second point, that he was speaking at a popular level, not a scholarly level. This is a really difficult thing. To speak of scholarly level stuff at a popular level, you're going to naturally be forced to kind of simplify things. Now, my degree in college was music, and I excelled in music theory. So even at times with just a bachelor's degree in music and just talking to a bedroom guitarist, there are times I have to simplify concepts of theory so that the bedroom guitarist understands it. You're going to not be able to be as precise with that. So speaking at a popular level is an understandable thing. Now, regardless, I don't think any of this really matters to Stephen Woodford over at Rationality Rule. He seems to have his own definition of word for word.
Let's break this down, because there's quite a lot happening in this short exchange, and it's absolutely fascinating. Not for the reasons that Wes thinks, but for what it reveals about apologetic rhetoric. First, notice how Wes builds his case. He starts with a qualifier. This isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which sounds appropriately scholarly and measured. It's the kind of caveat that makes you think, oh, this person is being careful with their claim. Think about what word for word identical actually means. It means that if you laid these texts side by side, every single word would match perfectly. No additions, nothing taken away, no changes. They would be exactly the same. Emphasized 3 times. Every letter, every spelling, every small detail would be exactly the same. It's a claim of perfect preservation across 1,000 years. The problem is that that's just not true.
Now, notice what Stephen Woodford did here. Wes Huff said word for word, and Stephen interpreted it as letter for letter. Every letter, every spelling, every detail would be the exact same. But that's not what Wes said. Wes said word for word, not letter for letter. Stephen interpreted every letter, every spelling. And it's sad that Stephen can display Wes's actual quotes in front of his audience, change it, and them just not even notice or care about it. What's worse is that Stephen is using this to reference the apologetic rhetoric that Wes is guilty of.
Is this a common apologetic technique that you've encountered? And what does it tell you about how we should evaluate his stronger claims?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if I've coined this term, but I have gotten in the habit of identifying some people as skull apologists. I probably haven't coined it, but I use it. But you get what a skull apologist is, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
A skull apologist is a scholar who will take off his scholar hat and put on his apologetics hat and speak apologetically.
Mm-hmm.
This sort of careful nuance followed up by an apologetic claim is something that you would probably see more commonly from a skull apologist. And based on everything I have seen, I would put Wesley Huff firmly in that camp as well. His full-time job is working for, an apologetics organization.
Now, about this time, about the midpoint of the second act, our protagonist returns to defend himself. He starts off his video with a whole bunch of self-corrections.
Both myself and others have caught some things I said that weren't correct, and so, in light of that, I'm going to be making a response video to myself. I think it's the 10th article of the Mormon Church is that they believe the Bible insofar as it is translated. It's not the 10th, Wes. You lied. It's the 8th article of the Mormon Church that says that. Egypt is like Greece in that you have, you can go to the Pantheon and you see that kind of stuff, right? The Pantheon? Are you kidding me? The Pantheon is in Rome. Do you mean the Parthenon? Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once. I'm pretty sure that's 500. Ignatius of Antioch, arguing that there are only 4 Gospels in the 2nd century. Ignatius? I think you meant Irenaeus.
Since they're all rapid fire and kind of playful, let's just put them all collectively together as one self-correction.
There is, however, a criticism I'm seeing online that I think does require some attention and correction on my part. At around the 40-minute mark, Joe asked me a question about the Great Isaiah Scroll. And when he asks me how close it is to the modern Hebrew copies of Isaiah, I say that it is word for word identical to the later Masoretic text. This was admittedly a hyperbolic statement that I should have been much more careful on.
I guess I'll take that as a half self-correction. Now, Wes goes on to describe what he was thinking when he said that dreaded quote, word for word.
Let me tell you why I said what I said. What was going on in the back of my mind was a quote that I was recalling from Old Testament scholar Gleason Archer's A Survey of the Old Testament, where he talks about the copies of Isaiah found in Qumran Cave 1 in 1947, that they were 1,000 years earlier than the oldest dated manuscripts previously known, proving to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible, and more than 95% identical to the Masoretic text, specifically the Leningrad Codex, calling it almost letter for letter with that manuscript.
So Gavin was right. Gavin mentioned the Gleason Archer quote. Wes says that was what was going through his mind when he said this. And I think that's a fair judgment. I don't think we should be critical on him for this. I mean, remember, Dan did the exact same thing at the beginning of all this. He said that there are variations in almost every single verse, but he was thinking on a broader context. See, he was thinking one thing, but he was applying it in a different situation. That's pretty similar to what Wes was doing. Wes was thinking of Gleason Archer's quote, word for word in 95% of the text. He just forgot about the in 95% of the text part. So if we're going to be charitable to Dan, which I think we should be, then we should also be charitable to Wes in this instance. For him correcting this slip, I'm going to count that as another half correction. Now Wes's video itself wasn't that long, so let's go ahead and finish it.
Was my hyperbolic statement to Rogan a dishonest attempt to pull the wool over Rogan and his audience's eyes? No. Was I participating in disingenuous and underhanded apologetic tactics to try and gain points at the expense of truth? No. Should I have been more careful in my statement on Rogan about the Great Isaiah Scroll and used much more precise language, something to the effect of nearly identical rather than word for word identical, in order to not bring unnecessary and unfortunate scrutiny upon my discussion with him? Yes, but I hope you can see why I said what I said, and forgive me for my lack of precision.
So a point for an apology from Wes. Although it's kind of in between an apology and a self-correction. He's not like apologizing for attacking somebody else, he's just kind of apologizing for presenting misinformation, which is kind of a self-correction in a way. I think I'm just going to put it as an apology. As shown in Wes's response, he misspoke. He was thinking of Gleason Archer, who said that the Masoretic and the Dead Sea Scrolls were 1,000 years apart, and that they were word for word in 95% of the text. And Huff Off the Cuff just forgot about the 95% part. An important part, of course, but he can't take that back. All he can do is apologize and correct himself, just as Dan did. And now we're approaching the end of the second act, and of course the two bosses from stage 1 both make a return to tag team our protagonists together. Dan McClellan and Alex O'Connor did not really take so well to Wes's apology.
So, curiously, Wes begins by admitting that he was recalling two quotes, both of which are actually talking about a different text, 1Q Isaiah B, and not the Isaiah scroll, which is 1Q Isaiah A. But if you were looking closely, you might have seen that even here in his response video, he still misquotes Gleason Archer. Listen again, and I'll jump in.
They were 1,000 years earlier than the oldest dated manuscripts previously known, proving to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible, and more than 95% identical to the Masoretic text.
Pause. It's not word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible and more than 95% identical to the Masoretic text. It's word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of that text.
Pause. It's not word for word identical in 95% of that text. It's word for word identical in 95% of the text. Here's a screen grab with a YouTube generated closed captions. And here it is again.
It's word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of that text. Why would he do that?
You see, Alex O'Connor attributed this quote from Gleason Archer to be about 1Q Isaiah B, and not about 1Q Isaiah A.
So, curiously, Wes begins by admitting that he was recalling two quotes, both of which are actually talking about a different text, 1Q Isaiah B, both of which are actually talking about a different text, 1Q Isaiah B, and not the Isaiah scroll, which is 1Q Isaiah A.
But Gleason Archer actually said it about both 1Q Isaiah A and B collectively. His quote reads, "Even though the two copies of Isaiah discovered in Qumran Cave 1 near the Dead Sea in 1947 were 1,000 years earlier than our oldest dated manuscripts previously known, they proved to be word for word identical with our standard Hebrew Bible in more than 95% of the text. But in 1Q Isaiah B, the preserved text is almost letter for letter identical with the Leningrad manuscript. So the word for word identical in 95% of the text is about both 1Q Isaiah A and 1Q Isaiah B collectively. It is only in the almost letter for letter identification that is attributed to 1Q Isaiah B exclusively. But the word for word in 95% of the text that Wes was referring to was about both manuscripts. Thus is why he said they. So when Alex said 95% of that text, he's referring to 1Q Isaiah B. And that's why he says 95% identical to that text being 1Q Isaiah B. But the text that Gleason Archer is referring to is the collective body of 1Q Isaiah A and B together. Alex changed 95% of the text to 95% of that text to bring attention to it being about B, when it is about both A and B. in this section of the comments.
And to preempt some comments, you may think that I'm just nitpicking at his words here, or being pedantic, but remember, this is his awaited response to the criticism, and he's not speaking off the cuff. He's thought out and prepared the exact words he wants to say. So I think it's important to point out that even now, when showing us the words, he misquotes them while reading them out.
Oh, the irony.
Now, is this pedantic? Is this picking apart Alex's words too carefully and really reading too much into them? Yeah, exactly. That's kind of the point. Why is there this double standard where Dan can misspeak and correct himself, but Wes cannot? Where Wes gets torn apart by every single word and motive attributed to him, and Alex does not. They are holding Wes to a standard of which they themselves do not live up to. But Dan and Alex did not stop here. Dan particularly tore apart the almost letter for letter in 1Q Isaiah B.
This is also false. 1Q Isaiah B is not almost letter for letter identical. In fact, the editors of DJD 32 had this to say about that. 1Q Isaiah B exhibits 183 textual variants in addition to the 161 differences in orthography from other preserved witnesses to the Masoretic family. Thus, previous descriptions of the near identity of 1Q Isaiah B with M need to be tempered. So, as usual, Gleason Archer is incorrect.
Alright, this is again just being overly nitpicky. This time about Gleason Archer. Notice Gleason Archer said manuscript B is almost letter for letter identical to the Masoretic. And Dan says that that's not correct because there are, quote, 183 variants plus 161 spelling variants. So that gives us a total of 344 variants. Now Dan said that the Masoretic text is 25,608 words long.
There are 25,608 Hebrew words in the Masoretic text version of Isaiah.
1Q Isaiah B is not a complete manuscript, it's fragmented. So I looked up an estimation on how many words are in 1Q Isaiah B. The Google's AI said there were about 15,000 words. However, Google's AI also got confused with the information about 1Q Isaiah A. Now, 1Q Isaiah A is a complete manuscript, so it should be more than 15,000. So I'm not sure what exactly Google's AI is really coming up with. I'm going to aim low and say it's 10,000 words instead. Now, the average Hebrew word is about 3 letters long. So 10,000 words times 3 letters each would be about 30,000 letters. You've got 344 variations out of 30,000 words. That gives us approximately 98.853 repeating percent accurate. If, however, you take Google's 15,000 times that by 3, that would give us 45,000, and 344 variations out of 45,000, that gives us about 99.235 repeating letter accuracy of 1Q Isaiah B. Now, you can't play the whole letter for letter identical because Gleason Archer said almost letter for letter, not letter for letter. And 98.85 to 99.24, I think is close enough to be able to say almost letter for letter. But Dan just threw Gleason Archer's scholarship completely under the bus with this. And this honestly just keeps getting worse.
And to be clear, the problem is obviously not that Wes got this wrong. We all do that, especially in high-pressure, unscripted environments. The problem is with the response.
Is it perfectly understandable that he misremembered something because he was commenting on something that he was not particularly well informed about and was not his specialization? And we should give people grace for that? 100%. I'm totally in line with that. That happens to everybody who is engaged in this kind of public scholarship where we have to try to be generalists. And sometimes we find ourselves commenting on things that we don't know incredibly well. And sometimes we misspeak, sometimes we misremember. That happens. But how you take accountability for it, I think, says an awful lot about what your priorities are and what your ultimate goals are. And I don't think accountability has been adequately taken here. I think the attempt is still to salvage the apologetic goal of reassuring the audience that their dogmas are safe.
All right, so he accused Wes of just trying to defend an apologetic goal. That is definitely another dishonest apologist accusation on Dan. Here's the thing, though. Wes has taken accountability. He admitted his mistake, he apologized for his error, and he reached out to Joe Rogan to clarify his mistake. What more do you want from him? Rewind time and not say it? I'm sure he would love to do that if he could. But again, Dan made a mistake early on. did a video correcting himself and explaining why he made that mistake. So why is it okay for Dan to do that and not for Wes to do that?
Okay, I get that we're trying to be charitable, but there's being charitable when someone gets something wrong, and being so charitable that we don't admit that they got something wrong.
But every apologist who has tackled this has admitted that Wes got it wrong.
Now, it wasn't perfect for sure. I mean, Wes did make some mistakes. He even said so. A couple of things, like, for example, the claiming the Isaiah scroll is word for word. Not really true. He may have been just thinking hyperbolically.
So I'm not 100% sure what Wes meant by word for word. I'll leave that for him to clarify, and I've not reached out to him to ask what he meant because I imagine he is fairly inundated these days.
There is, however, a criticism I'm seeing online that I think does require some attention and correction on my part. I say that it is word for word identical to the later Masoretic text. This was admittedly a hyperbolic statement that I should have been much more careful on.
I think Wes Huff made a mistake, as he said in his video. But we don't need to be afraid of the facts. Let's give people the facts. Let's not overstate our case.
To Joe Rogan, and I would agree with you that perhaps the word for word, and I said that in my very initial comment, could he have been more careful with his language? Sure.
Wes himself admitted that he got it wrong. So what is it that you're really wanting? Why aren't apologists beating Dan's apology like a dead horse, like Dan is treating Wes's apology? Simple answer, really, because Christian apologists are far more charitable to their opponents than their critics are. It would be nice to have the charity returned. Ruslan really summed this up really well.
Are we being myopic in our need to be hyper literal as if Wes is a walking, talking encyclopedia in the middle of a 3-hour conversation in a high pressure environment? Perhaps we should give Wes a little bit of grace. Perhaps we should say, hey, he acknowledged. Word for word probably wasn't the best way to describe that. It's interesting that many of the skeptics and people that are trying to destroy the apologetics arguments speak like raging fundamentalists and are hyper literal.
Now, here's where the irony really goes off the charts. You remember how Dan said that apologists going from word for word to, well, those changes don't really matter. You know how Dan said that was moving the goalposts? Well, check out this moving of the goalposts. Remember how it started out with there are 2,600 variations, of which most of them are spelling differences? Check this out.
That is a widespread piece of misinformation, that the majority of these differences are spelling differences. And it's not the majority, it's not a minority, it's none. This list of 2,600 variants is found in volume 32 of a series called Discoveries in the Judean Desert, which is the official series for the publication of the critical editions of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I went and dug out my DJD 32 and counted up all the variants. There are 2,771 of them. I went through the volume and found the editor's own description of what they were doing with the list of textual variants.
The editors clearly specify, as you can see, that this list of variants only counts those which differ, quote, in more than mere orthography or meaning-neutral morphology, though ambiguous cases are included. I want to make it clear, I made this mistake as well. I also thought that the variants were mostly spelling-related, but in trying to correct me, Gavin has reiterated this false claim, arguing that most of these variants are orthographic or spelling-related, when in fact, none of them are.
Alright, so here we gotta give Alex a point for self-correction. I mean, granted, it's kind of in his favor, but it's still a self-correction all the same. Actually, we've got to give him 2 self-correction points.
And I made another mistake as well. That more than 2,600 figure actually includes textual variants across a variety of texts, not just the 2 that we're interested in.
To be honest, and granted, I'm not a scholar, so I could be missing something, but this claim is definitely very suspicious here. Every time I've ever heard of textual variants in a classical piece of literature, it has always included spelling variations. I did a brief study on Homer's Iliad, and that one, a lot of the research talked about the majority of the variations being in spelling variations. You also see this in New Testament manuscripts, where the majority of them are spelling. So this is definitely a suspicious new claim. That source that Alex quoted in his first video, it itself does say that these variations do include the spelling variations. Let's look back at it. At the same time, however, the 2,000-year-old scroll contains alternative spellings, scribal errors, corrections, and most fundamentally, many variant readings. Strictly speaking, the number of textual variants is well over 2,600, ranging from a single letter, sometimes one or more words, to complete variant verse or verses. So the Digital Dead Sea site itself says that spelling variations are included in this figure. Another Christian YouTube channel called Daily Dose of Wisdom also took a look at this.
I've been trying to corroborate this claim, but everywhere I look, I see that spelling errors are included as part of that number. His claim here is that the 2600 number does not include spelling errors.
The scroll contains scribal errors, corrections, and more than 2600 textual variants when compared to the Masoretic Codex. This level of variation in 1Q Isaiah A is much greater than other Isaiah scrolls found at Qumran, with most, such as 1Q Isaiah B, being closer to the Masoretic text. Some variants are significant and include difference in one or more verses, or in several words. Most variants are more minor and include difference in a single word, alternative spelling, plural versus singular usage, and changes in the order of words.
I just need to know, are these spelling errors really included in that 2600 number or not?
Spelling variations, 18,000 to 2,000, 70 to 75%. Grammar variations, 200 to 300. Additions or omissions, 100 to 150. Synonymous words, 200 to 250. Interpretive or theological differences, 50 to 100.
Is the final part of that sentence where it says, though ambiguous cases are included, is that the culprit for the confusion here? Is that what Gavin Ortland and Alex O'Connor both kind of misunderstood originally? Again, I don't actually know, but I do understand why there's confusion.
And I do want to actually answer this. So what is the ambiguous cases? I think a good example of it would be, suppose in like 2,000 years from now, our modern English, we've only got a few fragments of what it was like. And say future scholars are looking back at like older English that used the word thither, did not have the word there, just used the word thither. However, they did have the possessive case there. And so one manuscript, they see something that says there, and then another manuscript, they see something that says there. Will they know that there is a different word that has replaced thither in later English? Maybe, maybe not. This would be an ambiguous case, and I think that's probably what's being referred to in this ambiguous cases. We can know a lot about ancient Hebrew, but it can also be really hard to know for sure if something is just a spelling variation or a different word entirely. Heck, we could even just look at the difference between lead and lead. Similar context, similar meaning, and yet different words. Or lead and lead. Man, that's confusing. Now, spelling versus word is one thing, but here's a thing that's missing in all this context. What's a word? And I'm not being facetious here, because the truth is language is complicated, and what's multiple words in one language could actually be just one word in another language. Noting that these manuscripts are in Hebrew, not in English, so we can't just look at the English and say, oh, this is multiple words, therefore it's not word for word. We have to look at the Hebrew. And on the Hebrew, it's actually much more complicated to really clearly say what is and is not a word. I'll let Anthony Ferguson describe it a little bit further.
This might seem very technical, but what counts as a word? That's a very, very important point we need to make. So melech, for example, is the Hebrew word for king. But if you add a pronominal suffix like malko or malki, malki would be my king, malko would be his king. Is malko one word or two words, right? So if malko in your statistics is just one word, well, then your common denominator, like your total words in 1Q Isaiah A, is going to be much, much less. And therefore, the amount of variance is going to be much, much less. So I think we're seeing different statistics thrown out there because we're counting the words and the variance differently in 1Q Isaiah A.
All right, so Anthony is very much right here. Sometimes words can be altered without changing the word, but altering the grammatic structure. For the example that he gave, melech as king versus malchi, my king, malcho, his king. Now this is not fully to say Hebrew does not have a word for my. It actually does have a word for my. It's shali. And it kind of seems to be rather confusing. Sometimes in order to develop a possessive case, Hebrew will just throw an E at the end of it, and other times it would throw an entire word shali at the end of it. So for example, the word chalom, which means dream. Every time I've heard it used in context to say my dream is chalom shali. Whereas the word ben, which means son, every time I've heard that used in context, it's beni, one word. So sometimes what's changing is not a word, but just a grammatic structure of a word. And how do you count that? In English, it's very cut and dry. If one variation said your king and another variation said my king, we would just say your and my is a separate word. That's clearly a different word. But in Hebrew, that's not a separate word. That's just a separate vowel at the end of a word. Does this change word for word? Debatable, right? It really does depend on what you mean by when you say word. But let's look at an example that Dan McClellan gave, because this is a wild one.
And so this is the beginning of Isaiah 53, and I've underlined in red all the meaning differences that have to be represented in translation. And then here is the rest of Isaiah 53 with those meaning differences highlighted.
All right, now, Ruslan over at God Bless Studios, he took a look at this claim from Dan. He enlarged the image to really take a look at what Dan was pointing out of the variants of Isaiah 53. He found some interesting things in that. Let's check it out.
But it's very interesting that when we looked at Dan's initial response to Wes, we found that his own screen grab showed variants that seemed extremely inconsequential. So here is from Dan's original video, some of these variants, okay? Now they're underlined, and if you look closely, it says the word and, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This needs to be about a dozen variants, and 5 of those variants is the word and. Now we all have to come to our own conclusion. These variants that are significant, are these significant variants if the word and is in here 5 times, but the other words are things like whom, look at him? Are these significant variants? Are these significant things that change the text, change the meaning of the text, change the application of the text, change anything about the reliability of the scripture? I think people have to do their own diligence and work through that. But these are the type of variants that Dan himself highlights. These are the type of variants that no one goes on to explain in any of these videos. And I would love for Dan or Alex to go and tell us, how does this change the actual meaning of the passage? How different is this?
Ooh, pick me! I want to explain this to Ruslan.
Oh, pick me! Oh, I know, me!
No, legitimately. If somebody could pass this video off to him, I would love for him to see, if nothing else than just this part of this video. Because he has no idea how right he is. And yes, I will use the word shocked. Ruslan will be shocked when he sees the Hebrew implications of this addition of the word and. So you know how Anthony was just describing what constitutes as a word? This is definitely a case here. Hebrew does not have a word for and. I'll let that just sit a moment. Hebrew does not have a word for and. So how do they communicate a conjunction? They do have a way, but it's not through a word. Hebrew uses a prefix of vav before a word to communicate a conjunction. What's a prefix? A prefix is a small addition at the beginning of a word to slightly change its meaning. Let's consider the prefix re in English. If you consider the difference between to build something versus to rebuild something. Re is a prefix which means to do again. So rebuild, redo, refill, reload. Re alters the meanings of these words to communicate that it's being done again. Now, just like English loves throwing entire additional words for small grammatical structures like my, your, his, her, English also enjoys having pretty big meanings out of their prefixes. But Hebrew actually has very small meanings out of its prefixes. So another prefix in Hebrew is the prefix ha, or h. You throw a ha at the beginning of a word, and it's the indicative article, the. So if you hear a Messianic Jew talking about Jesus or Yeshua being the Mashiach, you realize they will often say ha Mashiach. The ha at the beginning of Mashiach is the indicative article, the Messiah. So vav is another prefix, and it means and. It's not a separate word. It's a prefix only. So what does that mean? Well, technically, whenever a manuscript adds the word and, they're not adding a word. It's still the exact same word. It's just getting an extension at the beginning of it. So these 5 variations in Isaiah 53 where it adds the word and, those wouldn't technically affect the word for word thing that Wes said. But that's just a general usage of the vav prefix as a conjugate. But the vav functions more than just a conjugate in Hebrew. Google's AI has a really good interpretation of this. It says, the vav conjugation in Hebrew is a prefix that is used to join words, phrases, or clauses. It is spelled with the letter vav. The vav conjunction can be used to mean and or, but, now, or then. Now, the specific usage in this case of Isaiah 53 is not a conjugate. It's something that's unique to Hebrew called the Vav consecutive. You can see it down here in this AI translation. The Vav consecutive is used in biblical Hebrew to prefix verbs in a continued narration. It's in a continued narration. So let's look at one of these examples that Dan McClellan gave. This is without the Vav and. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Note that this sentence has two ands in it. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. But none of those are the Vav in question for this variation. The Vav in question is added. He was despised and forsaken of men, and a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Notice how small that difference is. It literally does not change the meaning at all. It's even smaller in Hebrew. So what's the purpose of it? It is a grammatical structure in Hebrew. Google's AI describing the Vav consecutive as a continued narration is a good interpretation of this. It's just smoothing out the flow of the phrase. It's a slight Hebrew expression to tie two thoughts together as natural outpourings of one another. I think the best way I can articulate what this Vav is doing, translating it into English, would be something so subtle I cannot pronunciate the difference, so I'll just actually show you the difference. This is without the Vav conjugate. He was despised and forsaken of men, semicolon, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. This would be my interpretation with the Vav consecutive. He was despised and forsaken of men, comma, dash, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Debatably, this hardly affects the word for word at all. Debatably, this hardly affects the meaning at all. So I don't think this should count against the word for word. Obviously, it is still a variation, but again, it's just showing how small, how petty these 2,600 variations are. That's the thing about statistics. You can use statistics to sound intimidating without getting into the details about what those statistics actually mean. These people criticizing Wes Huff, they're accusing him of not being clear with the data. I mean, who's the one not being clear with the data? Dan considered this a major variation that changes the meaning of it. What's the meaning change? Practically none. So slight of a meaning change that when you translate into English, really the best way to articulate it is only in the punctuation. So in editing this video, I wanted to double check some things on the Hebrew between the 1Q Isaiah and the Masoretic, specifically on this Isaiah 53 passage. So I looked up trying to find it, and I was hoping to find it in Hebrew, but I was only able to find stuff that had it in English, which has some translation problems, but this site I did find some interesting things on. So this site here, it shows in green here, words that are spelled different. So here, words present in this scroll but with spelling difference that do not affect meaning are in green like this. However, red is what's actual word difference is. So the Masoretic is red with a strike through, and the Dead Sea Scroll is red with a line underneath it. So anyway, when we look at this and compare it to what Dan said are more than just spelling variations, we find some interesting things. So if we look at Dan's here, who has believed our message and to whom, more than just a spelling variation. Whereas here we see who has believed our message in green. Dan did not include that, but to whom in green, which Dan did include that one as more than a spelling variant. But this site says it is just a spelling variant, just in green. If we go on, he had no majesty, that we should look at him. Red, which means more than a spelling variant. He had no good looks or majesty. Green, which means just spelling variant. That we should see him. Green, that means just spelling variant. Which, by the way, this is why I wanted Hebrew, because obviously Dan's source is translated to English different from this source that I'm looking at, which is why it's different in this, but that's just translation. So that's not the actual sources themselves. Anyway, the point being, as we can see here, these variations that Dan is saying is more than just spelling variations. This site here is just saying that they are only spelling variations. So what's up with that? There are only 3 here that are not just spelling variations that are in red. See, you can see down here the and. This is a Vav consecutive that we looked at. He was despised and rejected by men, and a man of suffering and acquainted with disease. This is what we looked at already. It's a Vav consecutive. It's a prefix. It's not a word. But that's the only one in this entire page. This entire page that Dan is saying is more than spelling variations. Only one of them on Dan's more than spelling variations appears as more than just a spelling variation on this. And that one is the Vav consecutive and, which isn't even a word, it's a prefix in Hebrew. On the second page that Dan's got, we've got, again, just another Vav consecutive. As a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Again, the Vav consecutive, exact same thing as what we looked at with the previous one. There's one more, down here on verse 9. They made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man, in the Masoretic text, in his death. In the 1Q Isaiah A, they made his grave with the wicked, and with rich people, in his death. So it changes from a rich man to rich people. Now here's the thing about this one is most ancient languages like Hebrew, and which is why I wish I could see the Hebrew instead of the English translation, quite often men can get translated as people, right? Because men means two things. Men can mean just males, or men can mean humans, including females. So this translation, it could just be a singular plural difference. That could be the only difference. And this is all of the variations in Isaiah 53. According to Dan's standard, that is more than just spelling differences. This site here has every single one of them as just spelling variations. Dan says that all these are more than spelling variations, but the only 3 on here that are more than just spelling variations is 2 Vav consecutives, prefixes of and 1 word changed from singular to plural. That's it. Now, these critics have presented all of this as major changes to the book of Isaiah, but with very few exceptions, they're not major changes. They're orthographic spelling differences, updates to modernized language, fixing the word order as language changed, reordering the words, and small additions with words like and, which isn't even a word in Hebrew. And yes, of course, there are a few actual differences. A couple of omissions, a couple of slips of the pen, a couple of omitted verses, and a couple of embellished verses. But from all these videos, only a few of those have actually been addressed. Now, Gavin goes on to talk about how even some of these missing verses are in other copies of these, and then Alex addresses that. There's a whole bunch more that I would actually like to say about this. I unfortunately did not get to talk about Jesus claiming to be God. That was one that I really wanted to address, but this video just became too long, so I'm not going to be able to address everything in this. I think the main conclusions that I've come to is that the critics have been extremely hypercritical and very uncharitable, and really have had a lot of double standards. They present statistics without really articulating what the statistics really mean. And again, they let Dan make a mistake and apologize and just get away with it, but when Wes made a mistake and apologized, you still gotta dogpile him and call him a dishonest apologist. Actually, because I didn't want to address everything, these numbers are way too low. So let's do a speed round of dishonest apologist accusations.
When apologists overplay similarities and sweep differences under the rug, they're not just misleading people, they are robbing their own tradition of its rich and fascinating history.
It doesn't surprise me that that kind of thing would be omitted from a quotation, because it would be phenomenally unhelpful for his rhetorical goals to have that in there, because it's going to raise more questions than it's going to answer.
This kind of lays bare the apologetic endeavor, because rather than engage directly with the data and be honest about it, Gavin is trying to do what apologetics always tries to do. Reassure the audience who already agrees with you that they are justified in that agreement. And you do that by performing confidence and competence. Unfortunately, neither Gavin nor Wes has particular expertise in this area, so they're just repeating things they have heard from other apologists that reassured them, and just performing that for their audience so that they can feel reassured. The only reason this could at all be relevant is if Gavin is trying to reassure the audience that something has not been lost. At least for Gavin, this video demonstrates that the priority here is not getting the data correct. The priority here is performing competence and confidence so that your audience who already agrees with you can be reassured that they are justified. 99% is not correct. That is a nice round rhetorical exaggeration that Peter was using because he was giving a faith-promoting presentation to a religious group.
So is there any reason to think that Wes Huff and Gavin Ortland and all these apologists are just trying to use an apologetic approach, an apologetic misdirection, and not caring about the data and trying to cut off complications to give their audience a false security? Nope. Sure, Wes Huff misspoke. He said something that was objectively not true. He corrected himself, as did all the other apologists who are looking into this. But all of this is far more complex than what the critics have said, and the blind statistics that they gave do give a false impression on the reliability of the book of Isaiah. So anyway, guys, thanks for watching, and keep the faith.